It's my absolute delight and privilege to introduce Professor Beverly Skeggs to all of you. If you were at the closing conversation yesterday, you would have already heard a partial introduction from Alpa Shah, who said that Bev Skeggs is a pioneering feminist and the one who's made discussions of care at the LSE International Inequalities Institute possible. And if you'll remember, I talked about in my introductory remarks yesterday that this conversation has partly come about through the discussions that we had at the International Inequalities Institute when Bev was leading on the care economies theme. Bev's incisive scholarship addresses the multidimensional nature of inequalities, exploring how contemporary ideas of the self implicitly discriminate against many groups, including women, Black and minority ethnic groups, migrants, and the economically deprived, who are seen to fall short of the assumed liberal values of control and autonomy. And in recent years, supported by numerous grants and fellowships, Bev has explored the relationship between moral values and economic value through studies of traditional and social media. And we've been discussing these issues over the last 3 days, and it's been wonderful having Bev in the audience all 3 days and to also hear people reference her work when discussing various aspects of care. We're very grateful to you, Bev, for agreeing to deliver the concluding remarks, and I'll hand it over to you now.
I can't believe you persuaded me to do this, Azira. It's a challenge, 50 minutes. But first of all, I want to use a minute to say congratulations to you and your team. It's been truly, truly amazing to see at this stage in my career a 3-day conference on care is amazing. And I just can't tell you how incredible that is. It's really remarkable. It's also, you're also amazing organisers. You've been so good with moderating and questions. So what a remarkable team. It's great to know this is flourishing and it's going to continue. It's also been remarkable to pull together so many really interesting global scholars. So I think the 3 days and the scale of it has been quite extraordinary and exemplary to all of us. So I'm going to try and pull some of this together. But, 3 days, I've got pages and pages of notes, and my notes for this are so tiny now. I don't know whether I'll be able to hold on to them all, but I'm going to try very, very carefully to do this, because I think when we start talking about care, it's a bit like talking about the economy. We're actually defining everything. And so we've had 3 days, which effectively could have been weeks and weeks in terms of all the different aspects of care and how it's organised through the economy, through the state and whatever else. But I think there's some fundamentals that I just want to pull out from the conference. So apologies if I don't name people, because that would take me ages. I've got everybody's names written down. But also I won't refer specifically to most papers, because again, there's so many and it's so complex. But there's been some amazing, just amazing perspectives offered, I think. And so I think, I'll take up what Joan Toronto has been saying for many years, along with many other feminists, is that we actually need an economy based on care, a care economy. One that actually factors in care as foundational and as fundamental, and that's where we begin. We don't begin from greed, wealth, growth, exploitation. We actually begin from what enables people to flourish and thrive and live and survive. And so I think for me, that's absolutely fundamental. And we need to really move on, because I think in the UK now, it's so obvious that care is a positional good. It is based on your class, race, gender in really, really straightforward ways. You just don't receive care if you don't have any money. There are care deserts in the UK where, that's it, no care whatsoever. But I mean, that will take us into a bit of a debate about the state. But we need one where class is not entrenched, where the majority of women who go to work do not have to depend upon informal employment and some horrific exploitative relationships, so that the freedoms of the global north are not dependent upon the absolute exploitation of the global south. And I think that still needs addressing, and we saw that in some brilliant papers on remittances and the significance of compensation. And so we need to really think about the models that would enable proper care to exist. And so it's not an entrenched class relationship, which it is in so many places. And it could be different. It really could be different. We could stop the great speed of financialisation as it takes over care homes and strips them and then destroys them and leaves people without any care whatsoever. And financialisation, I think 90% of childcare is now owned by private companies. We really need to put an end to that. And the Care Manifesto, which is brilliant, and Emma Dowling's book also brilliant, call outs there, you know, do show how we can end all this privatisation. It is possible. We can organise the economy differently. And Linda pointed to the Women's Budget Group, their report, which is fantastic. There's also the foundational economy. There's also the Preston model that we have here that's been talked about. There are other ways of organising an economy, not just for the really rich and the super greedy. So I think that's really important. And we need to keep asking, in whose interests is it organised in this way? You know, who does this benefit? And I think that question, well, we've seen it writ large with COVID, and a study I did with care workers where they had no protections whatsoever, was just horrific. So, you know, we need to think about in whose interest are people being put to death at the moment. I think it's pretty important. And so for me, and it was something that Mary mentioned and she's worked on and is very important, and lots of other papers were referencing, is how to think about care work, both paid and unpaid, together. It is about social reproduction together, because what we saw when the South African study about the surplus populations was that just to have a livelihood, they have to do so many things just to survive. In the north, in the rich global north, people have to take on many different jobs and lots of debt just to be able to survive. They can get access to debt, that's quite different. But, you know, they have to do so many things that encroaches upon the spaces for care of themselves as well as others, and the time to care. And this is like a fundamental organisation of our division of labour, and that really needs addressing, and people are addressing it. But I do think we've got to think a bit together, and I think livelihood is actually a really good way to think about it. We also need to think globally, because, you know, people have talked about global care chains, they've talked about migrant labour, they've talked about movement. You know, we need to think about how does this happen and how do we rethink it? There's so many things that people have been rethinking about over the last 3 days that we really need to move on now, that we really need to think about how can we do something and build upon this. I also think the fundamental question here is about value. And yeah, I've worked on the link between economic value and moral values. And I think that's where care is particularly complex, because they come together, they get fused, and they become really difficult to pull apart. And we can pull them apart in abstract frameworks, but actually when we see them together, it's really hard to do so. And when we're practicing care ourselves, it's really hard to do so. So I think we need to think about the value of care, for whom, where, and how. We had, over these 3 days, amazing papers on the histories of care, things I've never thought about all these different alternatives that were being formed, about the link to medical histories that were really important. And we saw how legacies of empire are still shaping particular forms of care. They are really significant. So on the one hand, we have legacies of empire, which will always shape how particular forms of care are offered or withdrawn or not offered, or even the forms families take, for instance. But we also saw alternative forms of support. And I think that's what's been really good throughout the 3 days, is that we get these really hardcore critiques of what's actually happening in terms of provision, in terms of capital-state relations. But then we also had some really brilliant examples of alternative and radical spaces of care. And I'll go on to that in a minute. I just was really taken by the number of spatial metaphors that were being employed to analyse care. And it made me think back to very old papers in geography by David Harvey and Neil Smith about how metaphors of space enable us to see beyond the conditions of possibility that we exist in and to imagine different ways of being and different futures. But we've had the last session was incredible: cartography, circuits, chains and connections. And I think it's important to keep these on the agenda in whichever model you want to use, but to think about connectivity. So we've also had very different physical spaces of care, and the digital has become, I think, much more significant. And we saw that in the trans support paper, how alternative communities can use the digital to find forms of support. We've also seen how the digital can be used to kind of marketplace care workers, sell them and push wages down completely. So again, there's always an ambivalence practically around everything to do with care. So, you know, because it's good as well as being organised in very particular ways for very particular interests. I was also struck when thinking about the geographical spaces of care. I was very privileged to listen to a wonderful paper on Ethiopian breastfeeding. And who'd have thought that the government sending politicians into areas to teach women how to breastfeed, and their resistances and responses were very funny, was almost identical to the people who've been sent in to train working class women in Britain to make beds on caring courses that I studied many years ago. So I was struck by both the differences in geography, obviously people like Linda's paper in South Africa, struck by the very radical differences in geography, but also by the universal forms that connect together, you know, political opportunism, patronising women on a civilising mission still, you know, like the empire never ended. So those sort of things, we can think about how do they all work together and what are the similarities, and we can learn from how they get changed in one area to another. And it was interesting that Nadia, I think, mentioned in Uruguay. You know, Uruguay has been doing some amazing work. We need to keep our eye on what's happening there and learn. So I think this has been a fantastic space for learning about how things can be different, be seen differently, but also there are some patterns in that as well. So I think what's been particularly exciting, partly because when people offer up examples of radical care or alternative forms of care or alternative spaces of care, it is something that makes you think, oh yeah, that's really good. Yeah, we could do something with that. So what we've seen, I think, has been some great radical acts around care, around sex workers. And as we know, they've been some of the most incredible groups because they've had to fend historically for themselves. So we've had some great papers in Sociological Review. I'll just do a plug for Solidarity in Care about Indian sex workers organising really, really quickly when they were closed down and thrown out of cities. Likewise, there was a really, really good paper on the resistances of sex workers to forms of care. I also was very taken by the description of Black Lives Movement as a radical care movement. And I thought, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's like these great moments where you just go, yeah, that's what's going on. So that was my recognition. But there's also been forms of alternative care through food provisioning. And I think we've probably all seen this or experienced it during COVID. We have seen the local forms of care have been what's kept people alive, has been what's actually enabled them to get through this. So we are seeing lots of locality care, but what we're not seeing certainly is any kind of state responsibility for care in any particular way. And I'll move on to that. What we've seen also, and again, protection against violence has been very, very localised, and that needs an infrastructure. So, you know, infrastructures are really important. We've also seen, there's been lots of examples of the complications of care and the ambivalence of care through affect, through love, through emotions, through all those difficult things of duty and obligation. And I think it is still useful to think about relations of care that are for, these are really old feminist divisions, for, about and with, because it's like, how do those relationships work? I'm coming to the end. I think what's also been really highlighted has been the significance of the nation states. And we've got to remember that nation states now are often working against global forces of financialization. Lots of states, like the French welfare state, is dependent upon debt, financialized debt. So we've got to think about how nation states fit in with local state provision, but how we do actually need them. It was probably about 5 years ago when lots of feminist theorising returned to rethinking about the state, which seemed to have disappeared for quite a long while, apart from in a very kind of entrenched area of social policy. So it's important to rethink the state and the role of the state. I mean, I know people have been saying we shouldn't rely, why do we think a national state's going to support us? But that's what we asked for. We want a national health service. We want something that will work for everyone, that isn't reliant upon geographies and where you live. So we've seen the significance of the national state. We've also seen really, really good papers on the significance of the municipal state. But in the UK, that's always a complex relationship because municipal states are usually socialist, or often, or try to be, and national states thrash them and take all their budgets away. So again, that relationship between the global, the national, the municipal, and then the really, really local. I do know that a lot of really good mutual aid was the most effective, and I think some of the LSE studies show this, was most effective when local states and mutual aid organisations had worked together and had been established together. Now, ultimately, all of this is a matter of responsibility. You know, we see capital transferring the responsibility for its workers to the national state transfers it down to the local state leaves it to the family. And if you don't have a family, well, you die. So it's all about responsibility, and it's all about who will take it when it is withdrawn from infrastructures of the state. And so I think to end, I think this ultimately takes us back to things like wages for housework, which have become, you know, the women's strike in the present, which also should be a very, very queer strike, not just the women's strike. But basically, who is doing all the care when states abdicate their responsibility? And we've seen who's doing it. Women's Budget Group, again, fantastic reports. And as Daisy put me on, Too Pregnant Then Screwed, again, amazing research on who is actually doing taking the responsibility for care. So I think there's a huge number of gendered, in different ways, people taking and holding the space of care. And at this moment in time, when we're doing it, when we can see it could be different, when we've got a 3-day conference on care, we should seize the moment. If we don't seize it now, we never will. In my lifetime, I haven't seen so much political work going on around care. So much work that's really, really engaged. So I want to end, as Claire said, on a note of hope. I think this is very positive. I think the conference has shown how everybody is really engaged with this. And I think if we share our knowledge and continue to kind of struggle and campaign for care, hopefully this time we will get somewhere. So thank you all. It's been an absolute delight. You are quite wonderful. Thank you.